the Occupy Money Cooperative. The Occupy Money Cooperative, or OMC, aims to be a national scale, cooperatively owned, FDIC-insured financial institution. OMC membership, and thus ownership, is open to everyone, regardless of income or address. Conventional banks often have barriers to entry, including minimum deposit amounts or punitive and prohibitive overdraft fees. Credit unions have fairer fee structures and can be cooperatively owned, but they are required by law to limit their membership by a variety of criteria. Only UC Berkeley affiliates can bank here. Only US Army affiliates can bank there. Payday lending and check cashing outlets are open to everyone, but have interest rates that can climb well into the thousands, literally the thousands. Ultimately, the Occupy Money Cooperative seeks to redress these shortcomings by creating a nonprofit national bank, cooperatively owned by its members with no barriers to entry. This is a difficult goal. Remember the Dutch Triodos example, an alt bank that uses RBS as a clearing agent. Or note the regulations, the laws that rein in and localize credit unions. Legal, technical, and capital hurdles to establish such a bank led the Occupy Money Cooperative to a tiered launch model, wherein individual products that are actually easier to produce than a national banking network would come first. So the first product they've launched is a prepaid debit card intended to enable basic banking, checking, and savings options without the opaque fee structures and hidden costs of other prepaid debit cards. The OMC has posted their fee structure online, including the unusual category, if you look at the very end, how to avoid the fees. You do not see this with other prepaid debit cards. In fact, the whole point of opaque fee structures is to get you to pay them when you don't know you're doing it. Okay, so this card, which has not yet gone live, has been controversial within the Occupy ecology, to say the least. In one widely cited response on the Occupy Theory website, Suzanne Ebrahimian writes, quote, "Yes, folks, the true agenda of Occupy Wall Street is here, to give you a negligibly better option within a system that's killing us all, and it's such a reasonable price. Go ahead, construct the same system you seek to dismantle. At best, it will never get off the ground. At worst, we'll just lump it in with all the other banks." And then, an equally cited response to that critique. Yes, Occupy Money is literally putting the Occupy name right above a Visa logo. We'll get to that in a second. However, to achieve their objective, this guy continues, there isn't any other way. Suzanne's critique, this author writes, demands every project to be perfect, which in our current situation is impossible, he writes. You're going to eventually end up relying on something, be it oil, Federal Reserve notes, or infrastructure. So that card uses the Visa network is probably the project's most controversial aspect. Analogous to the telecommunications infrastructure example, Visa, or Amex or Discover, is the only available infrastructure for internationally accepted payment systems. But Visa is also, of course, a multinational financial services corporation seeking to maximize value for their shareholders. So trying to hold these identities separate for a moment, what does it mean to think of Visa as an infrastructure? So according to David Stern, who has written a book about Visa, quote, Visa itself does not actually issue cards. Visa does not extend credit to consumers, nor maintain their accounts. It does not recruit business to accept the cards bearing its name, nor does it maintain their accounts. It does not even build or sell those little point-of-sale terminals used to read the cards. Visa is, in essence, an enabling organization. Visa, he writes, provides an infrastructure, both technical and organizational, in which multiple competing financial institutions can cooperate just enough to provide a service that none could have realistically provided alone. In short, he concludes, Visa makes money move. So here we are again at the imaginative impasse. Short term, does it make sense to go with Visa? Perhaps only if that choice changes the terrain of struggle in the long term. And though we can't know that, we can imagine the Occupy Money Cooperative using depositors' money to finance that public or open source telecommunications infrastructure, or to finance an open source alternative to Visa. And then the terrain begins to look very different indeed. So OMC's strategy at this point seems to be riding the rails of current infrastructure, Visa, FDIC. I should say riding the rails is coming from the project that Bill Maurer is doing on the infrastructure to finance. They seem to be riding the rails of current infrastructures, Visa, FDIC, with two intentions. First, putting those infrastructures to uses other than the maximization of shareholder value and hyper-securitization. And second, ideally, replacing them or building its own infrastructures alongside once it can provide the finance to do so. So, does this throw a wrench in the works? In certain ways, most basically, retail investors, you and I, are actually finance's most important sources of capital. The more money we are able to channel elsewhere, and the more power we have over what that elsewhere does with our money, arguably the better. OMC is trying to create one such elsewhere, albeit enmeshed in existing infrastructural networks, at least for now. Okay, so that's experiment one. Experiment two, strike debt and the rolling Jubilee. In the summer of 2012, almost a year into Occupy's existence, it became clear that debt connected many of the issues at hand. The housing crisis, ballooning student loans, medical bills forcing people to choose between chemotherapy and the mortgage payment, debt on municipal bond markets bankrupting entire cities, etc. The spike in these consumer and public debts is directly related to the secondary debt markets in which these future income streams, right, so payment from my car loan, payments from your mortgages, are repackaged and sold as securities, mortgage-backed securities, student loan asset-backed securities, slabs, they do exist. Strike Debt is building a debt resistance movement at the intersection of these issues. As the group's principles read, and I quote, "Most of us fall into debt because we are increasingly deprived of the means to acquire the basic necessities of life, education, healthcare, and housing. Because we are forced to go into debt simply in order to live, we think it is right and moral to resist it. Strike Debt holds that we are all debtors, whether or not we have personal loan agreements. Through the manipulation of sovereign and municipal debt, the costs of speculator-driven crises are passed on to all of us." So the Rolling Jubilee was one of Strike Debt's first projects and is still ongoing. And the premise is based on what we might call a hack of existing debt infrastructures. Defaulted debt, right, so unpaid medical bills, get sold to debt collectors on secondary and tertiary markets for mere pennies on the dollar. So if I have an $1,000 unpaid medical bill, a debt collector might buy that for only $200 from the hospital. He pays $200 for the right to collect that. And then that debt collector will make his profit by trying to collect from me on the full amount. And if I pay the full amount, which most debtors end up doing under the crazy harassment of debt collection, that debt collector just made $800 in profit. But notice that the market value of the defaulted debt is only $200. Often sometimes lower. So in the Rolling Jubilee project, an arm of Strike Debt jumped through the regulatory hoops to be certified as a debt collector, and then crowdsourced $600,000 to enter these secondary and tertiary markets to buy defaulted medical debt at these crazy leverage prices, and instead of harassing individuals to collect it, they abolished it. With another big announcement now circulating in the news, look it up, there's a really cool article in The Guardian right now. The Rolling Jubilee has abolished $14.7 million in defaulted medical debt to date. The medical debt buy that was just announced yesterday totals $13.5 million from 46 states and Puerto Rico. Okay, so the Rolling Jubilee is a creative repurposing of existing financial infrastructures and a great example, I would say, of the economic imagination at work. But the political endgame of Strike Debt is not to crowdsource away everyone's medical debt. Indeed, this is just a drop in the bucket. Rather, we think of Rolling Jubilee as a spectacular tactic, literally a spectacle, that can begin to draw attention to illegitimate debt and the way that it circulates and then recirculates in widening gyres of accumulation by dispossession. Our end game is a debt strike, or at least the credible threat of one. So writing about Strike Debt, Frances Fox Piven explains, just as bosses are dependent on workers, so are lenders dependent on borrowers. If workers walk out, the enterprise stops. If borrowers refuse to pay their debts, the lenders could be in real trouble. The millions of underwater mortgage holders, of student debtors, and credit card holders need the bank loans, but so do the banks need those borrowers. And they especially need them to cooperate by paying their monthly charges, Otherwise, the capital that the banks list on their books begins to drain away. And this is not only a fractional reserve question of how much capital banks have on their books, but it's also a question of direct action on the risk profile and cash flow in derivatives and securities markets. If I stop paying on my mortgage, that wreaks havoc in the MBS markets, as we've already seen.